Law School. We are so fortunate today to have someone who is brilliant and an alumnus of Rutgers Law School, and a professor who has taught, may I say, more than one generation of New Jersey law students at our neighbors down the street, and someone who has mentored many of us, including myself. Bernard Freamon is not only highly respected among his peers, but also looked up to by his students and former students. And he is going to speak today about his new book, which is a very exciting book, one that discusses a topic that is both controversial, especially among Middle Eastern communities from which I come. Like any, this is the Center for Security, Race, and Rights, so we talk about critical race theory all the time. And I come from the privileged group. I think there's definitely Arab privilege within global Muslim communities. And no one ever wants to talk about slavery, right? Especially slavery of people from sub-Saharan Africa. So I'm just going to show the book very quickly, Possessed by the Right Hand, The Problem of Slavery in Islamic Law and Muslim Cultures. This is clearly a very in-depth project that is probably a lifetime, right? Accumulation of a lifetime of work. I've had the pleasure of hearing Professor Freeman's chapters and articles that likely built up to this work at other conferences. So thank you very much for coming. And before I hand it off to my stellar law fellow, who is a 3L here at Rutgers Law School, I just want to encourage you all to follow us on Twitter at RUCSRR, on Facebook at RUCSRR, on Instagram, Rutgers CSRR. Part of our job is to engage the students, the faculty, the staff, and add energy to the intellectual life of Rutgers Law School and Rutgers University Newark, because education isn't just about what happens in the classroom. It's also about what happens outside the classroom, like at lectures such as today. So I'm delighted to see that you all are all here, and I hope that we'll see you at our future events this coming fall and next spring. And now I'll pass it on to Mbalu Saguru to introduce Professor Freeman.
Good afternoon. Thank you for being here. My name is Mbalu Sanogo. I'm a 3L, and I'll be presenting our speaker for the day. Professor Bernard Freeman is a native of Far Rockaway, New York. He received his bachelor degree from Wesleyan University in Middletown, Connecticut, and he received his Juris Doctorate from Rutgers University School of Law. So, go right, yay. He also possessed a LLM and a GSD degree from Columbia University School of Law. Professor Freeman is currently professor of law at Seton Hall Law School, where he achieved emeritus status with the university in 2016. He is a founding director of Seton Hall Center for Social Justice, where he participates in litigation before the U.S. Supreme Court, federal court, and various state courts, raising first 6, 8, and 14 Amendment issues, as well as a variety of state law issues having impact on the well-being of the poor, the underrepresented, religious minorities, lawyer, prisoner, and criminal defendant. In addition to teaching at Seton Hall University, he also teaches Islamic jurisprudence at New York University School of Law, and he offers a unique course on slavery, human trafficking, based in Zanzibar, Tanzania, for students in George Mason University Global Education Programs. He has a wide experience, having practiced law for over 40 years, and lectured, consulted, and published in areas of Islamic jurisprudence, Islamic legal history, comparative law, evidence, prisoners' rights, Slavery and the Law, Legal Education, and Professional Ethics. So in addition to his recent book that came out in June 27, 2019, Professor Freamon is the author of a number of important articles, books, chapter, and encyclopedia entry in Islamic law and jurisprudence. In fact, in March 2010, Professor Freamon was elected to membership in the American Law Institute, the leading independent organization in the United States producing scholarly work aimed at clarifying, modernizing, and improving the law. So I would like you to please help me welcome our speaker for the day, Professor Freamon. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mbalo. And it's an honor and a privilege to speak here, especially at my alma mater. And I trust the same will be true for you when I am done. I especially want to acknowledge some people in the audience who have been important in my life. Professor Doug Eakley in the back, and Professor Ron Chen to my left, former dean. Margie Crawford, who when I was a student here, I think was in the library or came after that, but I still think of her as my librarian. And several other, and Twyla Perry, who has been a colleague and a good friend over the years. So this, as the introduction points out, and I thank you for that introduction, this is a controversial topic, and I'm told I have about 25 minutes. It's very difficult to sum up a 570-page book in 20 minutes. But I'm going to do my best. This book is about 18 years of research and writing with articles coming in between and continuing research, and really only contains, from my perspective, about 40% of the research that I did. There's probably a second book that I can do, but the publisher basically said to me, time's up, let's get it out. And that's what I did. So I'm going to give you first an overview. My talk is both history and jurisprudence. It's legal history and jurisprudence, and I will do both and walk between the two. But I'm going to start with the jurisprudence. As we stand here today, as I stand here today, slavery under Islamic law is permitted. It is still permitted. One cannot understand the implications of that judgment without knowing the history, including the recent history in terms of Muslim insurgencies and Islamic law in recent times. So this book is actually, at least by my view, and the publisher agrees with me, the first comprehensive legal history of slavery in Islamic law that's ever been offered to readers. And I'm very happy about that, although it's a sad and horrific history, not a happy history. The book also articulates a theory in Islamic law for the abolition of slavery under Islamic law. One of my main arguments in the book is that Western efforts to abolish slavery in the Muslim world have been a failure, and that in the Muslim world there is an illusion of abolition, but the conception of slavery, the way Muslims think about slavery, and actually in many places the practice of slavery still is related to the original legal conception. And so my effort in the book is both to chronicle the legal history and then articulate a theory of abolition. And that's what I will give you a thumbnail sketch of today. So my first slide, if I can operate this technology, is to give you an overview of the book, and these are its main points. and you can see them there on the board. The title of the book comes from the Arabic phrase, it's a translation of the Arabic phrase, ma malakat aymanukum, which is the Quranic phrase that's used more than any other to describe those who are enslaved. There are many words in the Quran that describe the enslaved, not many, but some, about 5 or 6 words, but this one is by far the most frequent, and it is used 15 times in the Quran, and it's an idiomatic expression in Arabic, because as the title of my book shows you, it's not a book, a word that some of the other words that were used in the Quran that might be more graphic. It describes actually a conception of the relationship between the owner and the slave that at the time of the revelation of the Quran was a new conception, those who are possessed by the right hand. In addition to being used in the Quran more frequently than any other phrase to describe the enslaved, the Prophet Muhammad also used the phrase in his everyday talk about slaves, in his pronouncement of rules with respect to slaves, and most importantly, on his deathbed, when he was aware that he was dying, and people, at least this is a reliable hadith that have come, that people pretty much conclude is a reliable historical account. When people came around him at the time that he knew he was dying, and they asked him, what should we be concerned about? He said 2 things, prayer and those who your right hands possess. He used that phrase. So the inference that we can draw from that is that not just the Quran, but also the Prophet Muhammad at the time of his death and near the end of his life had a great concern about the welfare and the problem of slavery in Islamic law and jurisprudence. So my argument in the book is that this was a new conception, something which actually the early Muslims, after the dying off of the companions and the successors to the companions, forgot about. They didn't really take it to heart. And as I will outline for you today, there proceeded a horrific history of slave trading and slavery that lasted for about 1,300 years. Another thing the book does is it focuses on the Indian Ocean slave trade and slavery in the Indian Ocean. We have in the history, in the historiography of slavery, a phrase that many historians use, which is said, the way I can put it, it's called the tyranny of the Atlantic. That is, almost all discussion of slavery is concerned with the transatlantic slave trade and slavery as it occurred in the Western Hemisphere, both the Americas, the Caribbean, as well as South America, and the Indian Ocean has been ignored. Actually, if we look closely, more people were transported in the Indian Ocean slave trade than in the transatlantic slave trade, and over a much longer period of time, and there's a good argument that the Indian Ocean slave trade still exists today. So I talk about this in the book and try to contrast to some extent the differences in the Indian Ocean slave trade with the transatlantic slave trade. Just a couple of things. The Indian Ocean slave trade, not all about Africans. It was very multiracial. Africans predominated, especially toward the end, but you had Southeast Asians, South Asians, Afghans, Chinese, Africans, Arabs, Persians, a good number of people who were transported in the Indian Ocean slave trade. And secondly, the most important thing is that the transatlantic slave trade was one way from Africa to the Western Hemisphere. The Indian Ocean slave trade's multi-directional. and I have some maps that will illustrate that. So that's the second focus of the book. I also talk about a phenomenon that's unique to the history of slavery in Islam, and I call it, borrowing from a phrase used by a historian named David Ayalon, I've added to his phrase, I call it the Mamluk Ghulam phenomenon. Mamluk means in Arabic, one who is owned. And Ghulam, or Ghulam as it's pronounced, just basically means boy or page or servant. There was a phenomenon that developed in Islamic slavery that enabled someone who is described in that way to rise to the head of the community, even though that person is technically enslaved. So you had military and naval slaves that actually were much more important and had much more power and influence in the society than a free poor person. And that also, I think, influenced the conception of slavery among Muslims as we come today. I'll go through some of the rules, if time permits, some of the basic rules. And I also have identified in the Quran, as well as some of the other juristic writing about slavery in Islamic legal history, a concept which I call prioritarianism, which is a form of egalitarianism, first promoted and advanced, not first, but really put on the map in terms of 20th century legal thinking by a philosopher who's just passed away recently, Derek Parfit. And he talks about prioritarianism. And the idea of prioritarianism is that there are some people in society who deserve special priority. And the Quran, as well as the Prophet Muhammad, identified slaves as in that category. And the Quran actually puts forward the idea that slaves deserve priority in terms of social welfare and other forms of treatment. And my argument is that if you take prioritarianism to its logical extreme, to the logical end of the idea, you would come to the idea that it must be abolished, that the concept must be abolished. So, and that's pretty much the main points of the book. As I said before, I talk about the illusion of abolition, the failure of abolitionism, Western abolitionism, and I offer a proposal for abolition under Islamic law. So I start with the pre-Islamic world before the advent of the Islamic era and the Quran. And just a couple of things there. I'm really good at lists. I like making lists. And on the left is a list of all those societies that permitted slavery prior to the advent of Islam. And that's just the major societies, both religious and sometimes political or ethnic. And you see the list is a long one. The reason the Roman is, there's a 2 next to the Roman is because there were actually 2 eras in terms of Rome, the classical, the imperial Rome, and the Roman Republic based in Rome. And then you had the Second Roman Empire, which is generally described as the Eastern Roman Empire. Others describe it as the Byzantine Empire, and both of those permitted slavery. And then what's more important for legal purposes is all the ways that one could become a slave under the great majority of those communities. And it's a long list, and these are just the major ways. So you could be sold into slavery by your parents, by someone in loco parentis, captured in war, born into slavery, enslaved for punishment for crime because you committed adultery or some other sin, to satisfy your creditors, to be offered as security for a debt. If there was a famine or a tsunami or a flood or other kind of disease, other kind of calamity, slavery was a remedy to get out of that circumstance. And the Romans permitted unwanted children to be brought to the forum in the center of the society and then offered to someone who would take up and promise to raise the child, but they raised the child as a slave. The child was not free. What happens when Islam comes? Many Muslims think that Islam abolished slavery. It did not. I have a good friend of mine who said that's what his parents taught him when he was raised in Palestine, that Islam is opposed to slavery. There's an argument to that effect, but it did not abolish the practice. It did, however, change the law that I've just described. And I've put here on the right, the list on the right, the 5 main changes in the law worked by the revelation of the Quran and the example of the Prophet Muhammad. 1, there was a presumption of freedom for all human beings. This was also recognized by the Romans and to some extent by the Hebrew law, but Islam really put it in sort of neon lights with an Arabic maxim, which basically is translated as the original position is one of freedom. So if one does not know what one's status is in society, the presumption is that that person is free. Number 2, all of those means of ingress into slavery that I described in the previous slide were abolished, except for 2. And the juristic rules were very narrow as to those 2. So the only way one could be enslaved by birth, which remained, was the birth by 2 lawfully enslaved parents. If one of your parents was free, then the child is free. That's a lot different from most of the other systems. In the Islamic system, you could not have the Thomas Jefferson circumstance. You know, Thomas Jefferson owned his own children. That could not happen under Islamic law. And so you had to have 2 lawfully enslaved parents or capture in a jihad. And because the Quran and the interpretation of the Quran abolished all war except the jihad, which is a war in defense of the religion. Now, people did not pay attention to that. You know how it is with war. If there's desire for gold or other kinds of plunder, then people make war. And so you did have war other than jihad, but the only way that one could be enslaved is as a captive in such a war. There are really 2 forms of captives in that circumstance. There's the enemy combatant, and it's an alternative to putting the prisoner of war to death. It's to enslave the prisoner of war. And then there's the war captive, women and children, old men, others, disabled persons, others who it makes no sense to put them to death. The alternative was enslavement. That's the second change in the law. The third is, and this is seen in other systems sometimes as well, Muslims cannot be enslaved. So if one converts to Islam or becomes Muslim before the circumstance, then that person cannot be enslaved by the terms of the Islamic law. Fourth, and this is where the prioritarianism argument comes in, the shift. Islam made a shift away from enslavement as the preferred method of dealing with a person who is in a bad situation to emancipation. So the emphasis was shifted to emancipation, so emancipation became the priority with respect to dealing with slaves. So what happened? It meant that people coming into these large communities that developed in the Middle East, Cairo, Damascus, Baghdad, Tunis, Mecca, Medina, and some cities on the Indian subcontinent, Delhi, and Kabul, other places like that, you had constant emancipation of slaves. At least if people followed the rules, the effort was to emancipate rather than enslave. And so that created a paradox, which is that the people running these societies then needed more slaves. And that's really what gave rise to the Islamic, so-called Islamic or Muslim slave trade. Because once you had emancipation, people wanted to replace people who had been formerly enslaved. And the last was also most important. It's called the rule of Walid, al-Walid. It actually was done after the death of the Prophet Muhammad by the Caliph Omar, and the rule is in two parts. Children of concubines and owners, and concubinage was a big part of Muslim slavery, children of those relationships are automatically free, and the equal of children of marriages in those circumstances. So, for example, the longest caliphate outside of the Ottoman Empire was the Abbasid Caliphate, which was based in Baghdad, which was first established in 749 CE and lasted up until 1258 CE, about 500 years. There were 37 heads of that state. They're called caliphs. Of the 37 caliphs, 34 were people, men of slave origins out of these relationships. So this is a much different societal approach to slavery, in that slavery is not necessarily a stigma or something which would cause a person to be looked down upon, and that many of those famous caliphs, some of them are quite famous, Mahmud and Harun al-Rashid, and a couple of others who people write about these days, and lots of stories about them, they were products of slavery. Number two, the concubine is automatically free at the death of the owner, and there were some corollary rules. Once she had a child by the owner, she could not be sold or separated from the child. She was actually more secure than the wife, because you could divorce the wife, but once she has a child, she can't be separated from the family. So this is very different approach to slavery. And so I argue in the book that there was, in the early days of Islam, what Marshall Hodgson calls a bunch of piety-minded egalitarians, that there was an egalitarian moment and an effort where it looks like that slavery was going to go away in the Islamic conception of society, but that approach, which you would draw from the Quran and the Sunnah, was ignored. And in the name of empire, slavery and slave trading became the primary engines of the Islamic empires that pretty much flourished in the Indian Ocean. There was a unique ethos in Egypt. The Muslims in northern Egypt, which is called Lower Egypt, made an arrangement with the Nubians that the Nubians would supply, by way of tribute, 400 slaves a year for purposes of whatever the Muslims in the north wanted. And so it was called the Bact. It's like a pact. It comes from the Latin pact. And so this created a servile relationship between the Muslims in Lower Egypt and the Nubians south of Aswan and in Sudan, such that the Muslims viewed the Nubians as a servile population. That lasted for about 800 years. And there are other instances like that that I just can't describe because of the interest of time. And so what I argue in the book is that the egalitarian argument that you would draw from the Quran and those rules I just described and the example of the Prophet Muhammad were essentially ignored in the name of empire. And so in the book describes in one chapter a taxonomy of the kinds of slavery in the Indian Ocean world and in Muslim cultures, and it's a list there. Time doesn't permit me. I can take questions on some of them. People are particularly interested in what I mean by sultanic slavery. Specialists, artists, lawyers, doctors, architects, accountants, all kinds of specialists who were enslaved, but yet were, as I suggested before, much more powerful than the poor person who's free and working in the field. And you had lots of examples like that of people. There's a famous Islamic scholar called Suyuti, and his nickname was Ibn Qutb, which means son of the books, because he was born in the library of a enslaved woman. And she gave birth to him in the library. And so Suyuti is a good example of this kind of experience. This is just a graphic photograph. The British decided, they just woke up one morning and decided they wanted to end slavery. And at first they did it in the Caribbean, they tried. And then they eventually moved to the Indian Ocean. And this is a photograph I got from the Beinecke Library at Yale of Africans captured from an Arab dhow. They were being transported across the Indian Ocean to the Arabian Peninsula. And it's a graphic photograph. I think it's quite compelling. Because you know why? Because it's all children. African children. There are some girls in that group, but it's mostly boys. And you have the sailor in the back with the little boy sitting on his shoulder, and there's one other sailor in the picture. And this is a photograph that has survived from the abolitionist effort. This is another etching taken from a photograph of emancipated, freed women in Cairo who came from Sudan and who posed for a photograph, and then someone made an etching of the photograph, and the looks on their faces are also quite telling. So this is a map of the Indian Ocean slave trading routes. They're really the trading routes which were appropriated by the slave traders, and each one of those cities on that map becomes a slave trading entrepot. The most important was Zanzibar, which is off the coast of East Africa. There are others that are quite important, but I would suggest the most important of all of them was Zanzibar. The photograph I just showed you before of the young children was taken, I think, in Zanzibar. And we also have a map of the trans-Saharan slave trading routes, which is quite relevant today because of the migrant effort, the effort of migrants to get to Europe across the Mediterranean, and these same routes are still used in the transportation of those migrants. And there's still quite a bit of talk of slavery in that area. I talked to a young assistant professor of African American studies who visited Cairo just a few years ago, and she was warned not to go too far out in the desert because of the potential for kidnapping. Was quite attractive, young African-American woman, and some of that still goes on using these routes. So, I make a list here of those places where there is an illusion, a clear illusion of abolition. Mauritania has abolished slavery by secular law 3 times since 1980. All 3 times have been a failure. There's still a caste system that exists in Mauritania where people who were formerly enslaved can be re-enslaved. I interviewed a fellow in my mosque here in Newark. He said he went to visit his mother in Mauritania. They were having coffee, and then when a notable came to the house to visit, she ran and hid in the closet. Stayed in the closet while the notable was there. When the notable left, she came out of the closet, and he was shocked because he just grew up in America. He said, "Ma, why are you hiding in the closet?" And she said, "Because my grandmother was enslaved to his grandmother, and if he saw me here, he would order me to go work for his family, and I would have no choice. I could not go to the police or to the secular authorities to prevent that forced labor, or you might call it slavery, depending on the circumstance." There are others on the list. Time doesn't permit me to do with them. One of them that's most important, though, is this case, which is third from the bottom, Khadijatu Hadji versus the Republic of Niger, which was a case was brought by a young woman in Niger under the ECOWAS. There's an economic union of the West African community, and Niger is a member. And one of the provisions of that treaty that establishes that union is the abolition of slavery. But she was seized by a farmer or sold to a farmer. This is 1995. It's not like 18th or 17th century. Sold to the farmer, and he forced her to work on his farm and gave her 4 children and described her in the Nigerian dialect as his concubine. She ran away after having 4 children by him and got married to someone that she loved and wanted to get married to. He prosecuted her for bigamy and her husband for bigamy. And the Nigerian courts actually upheld his claim that she was his concubine. And a concubine is like a wife. Therefore, she could not marry someone else without his permission. And they found her guilty of bigamy, and she was imprisoned together with her husband in a different prison for 6 months. So she had some very good French lawyers, apparently French lawyers or French-trained lawyers. And so they brought a case against the Republic of Niger in the ECOWAS court, which is the Economic Community Court. And ultimately, she recovered damages for that horrible experience. And the court holds in an opinion, which is available online, that the Republic of Niger did nothing to prevent her from being enslaved. So you have other circumstances like that around the Muslim world, and so I describe it as a massive rise of modern-day slavery and human trafficking. The most famous, of course, most of you have heard about, are ISIS and the work of Boko Haram in northern Nigeria, where they argue that slavery can be used as a tool of war and that it's still permitted by Islamic law. And since they are of the Salafi persuasion in terms of Islamic law, they've argued that they can enslave captives because they claimed that they were doing some sort of war, some sort of jihad in those circumstances. There's also Abu Sayyaf, which is in the Philippines, which makes the same argument. Some of these groups have allied themselves to the ISIS, but the arguments are actually standalone legal arguments. So I suggest in my book the reason this is happening is because, unlike in the West, where we had a moral discourse about slavery, for good or for bad, that never happened in the Muslim world. So the ordinary Muslim has never really had to confront the moral problem with respect to slavery and the existence of slavery in the Islamic law. And so anti-slavery norms that we take for granted here in America oftentimes don't exist in the Islamic conception, in the Muslim conception. And so I articulate a way in my last chapter that normative discussion could be put front and center. And it involves this idea of prioritarianism, that emancipation of slaves and the elimination of slavery should be a priority of Islamic law. There's actually a verse of the Quran, 3:64, that would support the idea that slavery is unlawful under Islamic conceptions. It's related to the idea of the oneness of God. There's also temporary solutions under the Islamic law that could be put into place. The most important is the concept of maslaha, which is relying on the public interest, where you have facts that suggest that what would normally be permitted by Islamic law can be forbidden. And this horrific and genocidal history of slave trading that I have described, I suggest, justifies judgment that in the public interest of the Islamic community, there ought to be a declaration that slavery is unlawful. The hardest part has to do with the captives of war. If you actually look at the verses of the Quran on enslaving captives of war, it permits it, but it refers the rule to the customs of war. And actually, the customs of war have changed. We don't enslave prisoners of war anymore. Back in the old days, everybody did that. Now the only ones who say they can still do it are Muslim insurgents, the insurgents that I talked about. So I suggest that the customs of war have now changed, and even under the Islamic law, looking at those customs, enslavement of a war captive would be illegal. And so that is the last part of my argument in the book. It's the most difficult in terms of the customs, custom being a aspect of Islamic law. It's the most difficult argument that I confronted. But the others, I think, are pretty straightforward. And but you know, you'd have to take my Islamic jurisprudence class to really be able to discuss it in full. So that's my talk, and I thank you very much. You've been very good listeners, I noticed that, so I appreciate that, and I'm open to questions. Thank you.
Freeman, I'm going to use my, I guess, director's prerogative to ask the first question, and then to get also the conversation
I'm a little
started.
hard of hearing, so I may have to...
No, so I'll